Hi everyone, Chris from Stone Age Gamer here, and welcome back to the Gratuitous Rainbow Spectrum. For my money, one of the coolest things that's ever happened in the history of the video game industry was the leap from 8 to 16-bit games. Watching our favorite titles go from these simple basic things to expansive, crazy, colorful games with amazing sound and mind-blowing graphics was a truly memorable experience, and not one that's ever properly been duplicated in other generations. I guess you could argue 32-bit to 128-bit was a similar situation, but man, those sprites, going from NES to Super NES particularly for me, was unlike anything I had ever seen before or since. However, a lot of people didn't get to upgrade their new consoles to the 16-bit machines at the time, so developers occasionally threw us old NES fans a bone, and we wound up with some really awesome sequels that unfortunately flew under the radar because, well, those new 16-bit consoles were the talk of the town, and the 8-bit ones, well, weren't.
Early in the NES's life, there were a couple of racing games that everyone played at some point. One of those was Rare's 1988 classic RC ProAm. This game appeared in calendars, promo posters, and more as one of Nintendo's top-tier products, and with good reason. It was a great game. Graphics and gameplay were top-notch, especially for its time, and it was a massively common title to come across. 4 years later, the game actually got a sequel on NES called RC ProAm 2, and it was fantastic. Basically taking everything that made the first game great and bringing it to the next level, RC ProAm 2 delivered on just about everything you could have wanted in a sequel. The problem was, it released in 1992, and most players were happily moving on to the next generation of consoles by that point. For those that did track this one down though, they found an awesome racer with elevation changes, killer graphics, and even 4-player support. It's been one of the NES's more expensive games for ages now, but fortunately for us all, the game is fully playable in Rare Replay for Xbox One. The other racer that fits into this category of everyone played this thing would have to be Squaresoft's Rad Racer. This game has the unique distinction of being the last NES game to release in Nintendo's black box format. It was also included in the original Nintendo World Championships competition cart and was immortalized in film history by being the game Lucas Barton played with the Power Glove in The Wizard.
It's so bad.
Rad Racer was one of those inescapable games, and not in a bad way. For those who wanted to play Sega's Outrun at home, Rad Racer made for a pretty convincing analog. 3 years after Rad Racer took the NES world by storm, Square released a direct sequel called Rad Racer 2, and as far as I can tell, almost nobody played it. It wasn't heavily advertised, it barely showed up in gaming magazines at the time, and I don't remember any of my friends or rental shops getting the game. Probably because it really isn't all that special. Where RC ProAm 2 was remarkably ambitious, Rad Racer 2 felt like a lateral move at best, with only one car to choose from, and not much variety overall. It's still a fun game though, and if you were a fan of the original, definitely worth checking out since it's not exactly an expensive cart to find. Solomon's Key may not be considered one of the all-time classics on the NES, but it probably deserves a little more notoriety than it gets. It's a really fun puzzle platformer from Tecmo that fits right at home on the system. It's pretty addictive too. It was a moderate success and got a Game Boy follow-up in the form of Solomon's Club, but its proper sequel didn't come to the US until 1993, which was well after the NES's prime. It was also sort of a secret sequel here in the States too, because while it was called Solomon's Key 2 in other territories, we got a game called Fire and Ice, and the box art made it look a lot more like a Tetris-style game than a follow-up to Solomon's Key. It's sort of a shame too, because this is a wonderful sequel. It takes a pretty radical turn in terms of what you're doing in the game, but not so radical that it's unrecognizable as a sequel to Solomon's Key. In fact, the spirit of the original still rings very true, and then it's still a puzzle platformer, all about managing your surroundings. It's got great animation, which was a somewhat common thing with late NES games, and contains hours of fun puzzles to solve. It's another relatively expensive cartridge these days, but it's currently available for free as part of Nintendo Switch Online, so good on Tecmo for that. Also available to play right now on Nintendo Switch Online is the excellent and incredibly weird Star Tropics. This sort of Zelda-like adventure was originally created specifically for North American audiences and contained some incredibly memorable moments, like dipping a physical letter attached to the instruction manual in water to get a code to use a submarine. Also like Solomon's Key, it got a sequel that sort of hid the fact that it was a sequel at all because of its title. Unlike Solomon's Key, this wonderful game is not on Nintendo Switch Online. Zoda's Revenge is indeed a direct follow-up to Star Tropics, and it doesn't hide that fact anywhere except for on the box art itself. This game is Zoda's Revenge with Star Tropics II written really small underneath, which is a bit baffling because a lot of folks who played the original had no idea they ever made a sequel. It's a bit of a mixed bag overall because in trying to streamline the gameplay, they gave protagonist Mike the ability to move diagonally, which weirdly took away some of the game's unique personality, but it's still a very worthy successor to the original classic. It's been re-released on Nintendo's Virtual Console service a couple of times, but remains missing from NSO's lineup. Hopefully it won't be gone forever. Contra on the NES is one of the absolute all-time classics on the system, and its sequel, Super C, was an excellent follow-up. Better than its arcade counterpart even, Super C managed to take what worked about the first game and make it even better. It was better looking, more exciting, and just an all-around fun game to play alone or with a friend. Surprising to some people, there was actually a third Contra game on the NES, and it had nothing to do with Contra 3: The Alien Wars. It was Contra Force, and it was weird. Contra Force barely plays like a Contra game at all, and it exhibits an uncharacteristically striking lack of technical excellence for a Konami title. This game is bogged down by near constant slowdown. It was only released in the US, too, with a Japanese version planned under a different title since the game had so little to actually do with Contra, but that was ultimately cancelled. The game isn't necessarily bad, though, it's just not much of a Contra game, and considering it was released in 1992, the same year as the excellent Alien Wars on Super NES, it was kind of a hard sell. I personally only found out about the game when I worked at Funcoland by seeing it listed in those little newspapers. This one's never been re-released in any collections either, and remains one of the more expensive cartridges to find on the NES. Speaking of legendary co-op experiences, who didn't love Bobble for NES? This adorable action platformer pitted a pair of adorable dragon things against a ton of levels and a horde of weird bad guys through the Cave of Monsters to rescue your friends. It's got some of the most memorable music on the system, and it's still a blast to play today. There was a middling follow-up called Rainbow Islands: The Story of Bobble 2, but it played very little like its predecessor and never really found a niche on the NES. However, in 1993, again pretty late for an NES game, Taito released a rather charming actual follow-up called Bobble Part 2. It's a great-looking game that introduces colorful backgrounds and more well-animated characters to the mix, as well as new power-ups and boss battles, but it came at a pretty hefty cost. The simultaneous co-op has been replaced by having players take turns, which kind of defeats most of the point of the game. Still, Bobble Part 2 is an excellent game if you can get your hands on it. It's never been re-released in any form as far as I know, and remains yet another one of the most expensive NES carts to track down. Finally, let's talk about licensed properties. During the 32-bit era of video games, licensed titles started to get a pretty bad reputation. Most were schlocky, poorly put together messes of games designed to sell on name recognition alone, but back in the NES days, a lot of licensed games were really quite good. For example, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, Tiny Toon Adventures, and Ducktales. These three games were some of the most prolific on the console in their heyday, and all three of them had direct sequels that came out just a bit too late for their own good. Probably the most well-known of the three was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project, but even that wasn't played by nearly enough people. It isn't exactly a common game to find, and while everyone on Earth has probably played Ninja Turtles 2 at some point, even with having landed a cover story on Nintendo Power, Ninja Turtles 3 sort of flew under the radar, probably because of its 1992 release date and the aforementioned industry at large turning its attention to 16-bit consoles. Konami also put out a sequel to Tiny Toon Adventures on the NES, though it was a bit of a weird one. Not quite Contra Force weird, but definitely too much of a departure from its prequel to do it any real favors. Tiny Toon Adventures 2, Trouble in Wacky Land features some truly excellent sprite work from the wizards at Konami, and a pretty solid soundtrack as well, but is overall tragically much lighter on content, and plays more like a weird set of minigames than a proper action platformer. It also was a 1993 release, so yeah, definitely late into the NES's life. Finally, we have Capcom's Ducktales II. The original DuckTales on NES is nothing short of legendary, so making a sequel was all but a given for Capcom. Why it took until 1993 to actually deliver one is a mystery though. It's a solid game that would have sold like gangbusters had it released a year or two sooner, but unfortunately it was largely overlooked at the time of its release. It was included in the Disney Afternoon Collection though, so at least it's not that hard to play if you want to give it a go. That original cart though, that's another spicy one.
Unfortunately, like I said, a lot of these games can be difficult to track down in their original forms to play on original hardware, and a lot of them have never been re-released in any way, shape, or form. Fortunately, thanks to the miracle of modern technology, there are a number of ways that we can get our hands on these classic games and play them today. So if you were a fan of a classic NES game and you didn't know it had a sequel, well, now you do. Track it down, give it a try. It may not be quite as good as their 16-bit counterparts, but they are usually well worth your time to give a shot. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you liked what you saw here today, please follow, comment, like, subscribe, share, tell your friends, and also sound off in the comments. Let me know what games I missed that were late NES games that were really cool sequels to existing games, or even NES games that got sequels on other platforms that we just didn't know about because, well, it was a different platform. I don't know. I love hearing from all of you. Thanks for watching, everybody. On behalf of all of us here at Stone Age Gamer, keep playing games.